Jackson Albert knew his status in the neighborhood. With each mile he drove in his sleek black Porsche, he was more than aware of the silent judgment from behind the curtain-drawn windows of the extravagant houses. Every time he turned a corner, it was as if invisible eyes followed his every move, scrutinizing not just his car, but his very presence. For years he worked hard to make his way to the top, building a career that defied stereotypes and shattered expectations. Yet, beneath the veneer of success, there lingered an unease he could never fully shake off, a reminder that acceptance here was only conditional. As he turned onto Hawthorne Drive, the leafy enclave he called home for the past 3 years, Jackson relaxed just a bit. The familiar road, lined with manicured lawns and colonial-style homes, usually offered some semblance of peace. But tonight, that peace was fleeting. His mind wandered briefly to the new office project he was spearheading, a career-defining initiative that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. He allowed himself a small smile, feeling the weight of accomplishment settle comfortably on his shoulders. Then, in an instant, his serenity was shattered. Red and blue lights flared in his rearview mirror, blindingly bright against the inky darkness. His heart rate spiked. A deep frown creased his brow as he glanced around, unsure of what he'd done wrong. There was no mistaking the urgency in those flashing lights. It wasn't a casual patrol. The metallic screech of the police siren pierced the night, commanding him to pull over. His stomach churned as he eased his Porsche to the curb, the familiar roar of the engine quieting down to a low hum. He took a deep breath, willing his pulse to slow. The weight of what was coming pressed down on him, a heavy, invisible burden. He'd heard of these stops before, the stories of friends and strangers whose lives had been upended by a seemingly routine interaction. And now it was happening to him. From the corner of his eye, Jackson watched the officer step out of the squad car, her uniform crisp under the glow of the street lamps. He recognized her immediately, Officer Abel Claude. She was known around the neighborhood, a strict enforcer of the law who carried herself with an air of authority that bordered on overzealous. Tonight, that authority was dialed up to an intimidating intensity. Her hand rested on her holster as she approached, fingers twitching slightly, a sign of readiness, perhaps even anticipation. Jackson swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. "License and registration," Claude barked, her voice sharp and unyielding. It was a command, not a request. Jackson nodded quickly, his movements deliberate. He reached for the glove compartment, careful to keep his actions slow and visible. One wrong move could change everything. As he handed over his documents, he noticed her eyes narrow, suspicion etched into every line of her face. He could almost feel her gaze pierce through him, as if dissecting not just his identity, but his very right to be behind the wheel of such an expensive car. "This is your car?" she asked, skepticism dripping from her tone. "Yes, ma'am. I bought it a few weeks ago," Jackson replied, keeping his voice even, his gaze steady. He willed himself to stay calm, to show nothing that could be misconstrued as defiance. But something shifted in Claude's posture, something dark and unsettling. Her hand tightened on her holster. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered, voice low and threatening. Jackson's mind raced. "May I ask why, officer?" He ventured cautiously, the question laced with the respect drilled into him since childhood. "We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description," Claude snapped back, her eyes flashing with a dangerous glint. The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut. Jackson fought to keep his expression neutral as anger and disbelief surged through him. But this was more than a misunderstanding, it was an assault on his dignity. He glanced around, noticing first time that a few porch lights had flickered on along the street. Silhouettes of neighbors emerged, watching with a mix of curiosity and wariness. He knew most of them by name, people he'd greeted with a smile and a wave each morning. Yet now, their expressions were hard, unreadable. Slowly, Jackson opened the car door and stepped out, the night air cool against his skin. He stood tall, squaring his shoulders as Claude moved in closer, her gaze never leaving his face. She began to pat him down roughly, her hands moving over him with a callous efficiency that made his skin crawl. "Pretty nice ride for someone like you," she muttered, voice low enough that only he could hear. "How'd you afford it?" The question stung, each word a barbed insinuation. "I work hard, officer," he replied evenly, though it took everything in him to keep his voice steady. "Yeah?" Claude's eyes flashed, disbelief evident. "Where do you work?" Corporate law, Jackson answered, his patience fraying. He could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him, their judgment palpable. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who lived across the street, step onto her porch. She'd known him for years, watched him grow up from a distance. But now, her face was etched with something that looked a lot like distrust. "Spread your legs," Claude barked suddenly, kicking at his feet. Jackson gritted his teeth, swallowing down the surge of indignation. Slowly, he shifted his stance, feeling the humiliation burn hotter with each passing second. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, willing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let this escalate. "Officer, I'd like to call for assistance," he said quietly when he opened his eyes. His voice was firm, steady. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "Who do you want to call?" Claude sneered, a mocking smile twisting her lips. Jackson glanced at the gathering neighbors, hoping for a familiar face, for someone to step forward and vouch for him. So his gaze landed on Mr. Stanton, the retired banker from 2 doors down. But Stanton only stood there, arms crossed, his expression impassive. Miss Johnson looked away, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. Jackson felt a pang of something sharp and bitter lodge in his chest. Betrayal, isolation. It didn't matter how long he'd lived here, how much he'd achieved. In their eyes, he was still an outsider. An intruder. "Never mind," he murmured softly, his gaze dropping to the ground. Claude straightened, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "That's what I thought." As she turned away, leaving him standing there under the harsh scrutiny of his neighbors, Jackson knew that this moment, this ugly, twisted encounter would stay with him forever. It was more than just a traffic stop. It was a reminder of a reality he could never fully escape, no matter how hard he tried. As Jackson stood motionless, hands still raised in front of the officer, the air seemed to vibrate with the unspoken tension. The night was heavy and still. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the main road a few blocks away. The well-manicured lawns of the neighborhood, usually tranquil and serene, seemed to take on a sinister quality under the streetlights, their shadows long and foreboding. And in the middle of it all, Jackson could feel the weight of eyes on him from every window, every porch, every driveway. He was a spectacle, a curiosity, an object of suspicion in a community that he once thought he belonged to. Nearby, Mr. Patel, who usually greeted him with a warm smile, when Jackson stopped by his corner store, leaned against his doorway. His eyes were wide with uncertainty. Jackson's gaze met his, a silent plea for understanding, for someone to stand by him. But the hesitation in Mr. Patel's expression betrayed him, and the older man quickly looked away, his gaze dropping to the ground. The realization hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. No one was going to intervene. In the eyes of these people, he was already guilty. "Sir, I need to see some identification, right now." Officer Claude's voice rang out, cutting through the tense silence. Her posture was rigid, every muscle coiled as if anticipating a fight. With each passing second, as the crowd of neighbors grew, her voice grew louder, her tone more commanding. Jackson took a deep breath, feeling the burn of suppressed anger in his chest. He knew how this looked: a young black man, dressed casually, standing beside an expensive car with a police officer looming over him. The sight alone was enough to stoke suspicion. He could almost hear the murmurs of the neighbors, their whispered judgments carrying on the cool night breeze. But Jackson refused to be defined by their assumptions. He straightened his shoulders, lifting his chin slightly as he spoke. "Officer, I've already told you. This is my car. I live here. I'm not reaching for anything until you tell me why I'm being detained." A few of the neighbors shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. Some shook their heads in disapproval, muttering under their breath. "Kids these days, why doesn't he just cooperate?" One woman murmured, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "He's making it worse for himself," another man added quietly, his voice tinged with both pity and condescension. Jackson felt the sting of their words, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper now would only confirm their worst expectations. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could continue to argue, to assert his rights, but he knew how quickly that could escalate. One wrong move, and this could turn into something far more dangerous. "I want to make a call for assistance," he said slowly, carefully enunciating each word. He kept his voice steady even though inside he was trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. "I want to make sure my rights are protected." Officer Claude's eyes narrowed, her hand twitching closer to her holster. "Sir, put the phone down. I haven't given you permission to make any calls." Jackson hesitated, his fingers hovering over his phone. The air felt thick, as if the whole world was holding its breath. He glanced around at the neighbors again, praying that someone would step forward, that someone would see the injustice and speak out. But all he saw were closed expressions, cold eyes that watched with detached curiosity. Even Mrs. Johnson, who had once baked him cookies when he first moved in, stood at the edge of her porch, her face pale and tense. She looked away when his gaze met hers, as if ashamed. "Please, officer," Jackson said softly, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "I just want to call for help." "Put the phone down," Claude repeated, her voice like steel. The tension was unbearable, crackling in the air like static electricity. Jackson knew that one false move, one gesture that could be interpreted as a threat, would be all it took. He slowly lowered his hand, placing the phone back in his pocket. The decision felt like a defeat, a small concession to the mounting pressure. But he couldn't afford to take risks, not with so many eyes on him, not with Officer Claude's hand hovering so close to her weapon. And then, just when the moment seemed like it couldn't get any worse, another police cruiser pulled up to the scene. The crowd murmured softly as the car door opened and a tall man stepped out, his uniform pristine and his expression stern. Jackson felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe this officer would put an end to this madness. Maybe he would see that this was a gross overaction, that there was no reason for Jackson to be treated like a criminal. But as the superior officer strode toward them, his gaze sweeping over Jackson, that hope died a swift, brutal death. There was something in the man's eyes, something cold and calculating, something that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. He exchanged a brief look with Officer Claude, and in that moment, Jackson knew. This wasn't a rescue. "What's going on here?" the man asked quietly, his voice low and calm. But there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made Jackson's skin prickle. Claude straightened, her posture snapping to attention. "Suspect was being uncooperative, sir," she reported, her tone clipped and professional. "Claims this is his vehicle, but refuses to provide proper identification." The superior officer nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Jackson's face. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, suffocating silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he murmured, "Another one trying to push his luck, huh?" The words hit Jackson like a slap. He stared at the man, his heart sinking. He had hoped foolishly, desperately, that this man would bring some semblance of reason to the situation. But now, staring into the officer's cold eyes, he realized the truth. This man wasn't here to help. He was here to cement the nightmare that was unfolding. The neighbors shifted again, murmuring softly amongst themselves. Jackson could see their expressions changing, hardening. Where there had been doubt and confusion, now there was something else, something uglier. The arrival of another officer had confirmed their worst suspicions. In their eyes, Jackson wasn't a neighbor, a successful young man who had earned his place here. He was a threat, a criminal. "Put your hands behind your back," the superior officer ordered softly, his voice deceptively gentle. Jackson's breath caught. He glanced around one last time, searching for a friendly face, for someone, anyone who would speak up. But all he saw were closed doors, turned backs, and cold, judging eyes. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrist, Jackson knew he was truly alone. The superior officer leaned closer to Claude, his voice low but tense, just enough for Jackson to hear. He's stalling. "Radio in for backup. This could escalate quickly." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. What did they mean? He wasn't resisting. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here they were, preparing for something far worse. It wasn't just about his car anymore, this was something much darker. He realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't treating him like a suspect. They were treating him like a danger, something that needed to be neutralized. Officer Claude's lips curled into a smile as she brought the radio to her mouth. "Requesting additional units to my location," she said, her voice almost excited. "We have a potentially dangerous suspect." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. Dangerous? He hadn't even raised his voice, and now they were gearing up for a show of force. Taking a small step backward, he looked around at the gathering crowd of neighbors, their faces blurring together. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Others whispered to each other, eyes flicking between him and the officers. But no one moved to intervene. No one seemed to care. The truth hit him hard. He was utterly alone. The silence of the street was suffocating, broken only by the static crackle of Claude's radio. Then, the piercing wail of sirens sliced through the air, growing louder with each second. His heart hammered in his chest as a second police cruiser roared onto the street, its flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the houses around him. 2 more officers stepped out, their hands instinctively resting on their holsters as they walked toward him. Jackson watched, his stomach churning. He hoped, desperately, that these new arrivals might bring some measure of sanity to the scene. But their hard stares dashed any such hope. They weren't here to de-escalate. They were here to reinforce. So superior officer gave them a curt nod, signaling them to fan out around Jackson. Now 4 officers surrounded him, each standing at a different point, forming a circle that felt more like a trap tightening around him than a protective barrier. Jackson's pulse raced. Everything around him seemed to slow down. So to see every detail, the glint of the officers' badges in the streetlight, the way their muscles tensed under their uniforms, the cold glint of the handcuffs hanging from their belts. It all added to the overwhelming sense that something terrible was about to happen. As one of the new officers surveyed the scene, his gaze landed on Jackson's phone, still clutched tightly in his hand. His expression shifted immediately, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Put the phone down," he ordered, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You don't have permission to record." Jackson's grip on the phone tightened instinctively, his last connection to the outside world. He wasn't even recording, hadn't thought to press the button in the heat of the moment, but the realization that he should be documenting this, capturing every second, hit him like a punch to the gut. This might be his only chance to show what was really happening here. But before he could respond, the superior officer stepped forward, his gaze piercing, his hand still on his radio. "We're not going to let you film us," he said, his voice soft but brimming with menace. "You think you're going to use this against us? Not this time." Jackson felt his knees weaken as the words sank in. Not this time? What did that mean? His mind whirled, desperately trying to piece it together. He looked around at the circle of officers, each one poised, hands inches from their weapons, the air around them crackling with tension. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a powder keg, and he was caught in the middle. His gaze swept over the neighbors again, pleading silently for anyone to intervene. But their faces were impassive, distant. Even Miss Johnson, who'd watched him grow up, stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, her expression more curious than concerned. He felt a sharp pang of betrayal. How could they just stand there and watch this unfold? Before he could dwell on it, the officer in front of him barked out, "Drop it now." Jackson's chest tightened. He slowly raised his hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. A phone dangled precariously from his fingers. "Look, I'm not doing anything wrong," he managed, voice shaking slightly. "I'm just..." "Shut up." Another officer snapped, stepping closer, his hand gripping his baton. The sudden movement made Jackson flinch, and the phone slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the pavement. For a split second, everything froze. Then the officers moved. In an instant, one of them lunged forward, knocking Jackson off balance and slamming him against the hood of his car. Pain shot through his chest as the cold metal pressed against his ribs. The world blurred as they pinned his arms behind him, the sharp click of handcuffs cutting into his wrists. He gasped for breath, the rough salt biting into his skin as they pushed him down. "Stop." He tried to speak, but the pressure on his chest made it impossible.
"Shut it," the superior officer growled, his knee pressing hard into Jackson's back.
The crowd murmured louder now, some of them moving closer. A few gasps of shock, a couple of shouted protests. But it all felt muted, like a distant echo. Jackson's head spun. His pulse pounded in his ears as they hauled him up, shoving him roughly against the car door. "Why?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. No one answered. The officers exchanged quick, grim looks before the superior officer turned back to him, his face a mask of cold indifference. "You were resisting," he said simply. Jackson stared at him, disbelief mingling with the pain radiating through his body. "No, You're under arrest," the officer cut him off, his tone flat. The realization crashed over Jackson. It didn't matter what he said. It didn't matter that he hadn't resisted, hadn't done anything. They were going to take him in. They were going to make him disappear. As they led him toward the waiting cruiser, the weight of it all pressed down on him. The bright lights, the murmuring crowd, the officers' grim faces, it all blurred together into a whirlpool of fear and helplessness. But through the haze, one thought kept pulsing in his mind. I need to survive this. Because if he didn't, the story would end here, with him silenced forever, a victim of a system that saw him as nothing more than a threat. A story that, if not told, would be buried and forgotten. But if he made it through, if he found a way to survive, maybe, just maybe, the truth would come to light. And that, more than anything, kept him fighting as they pushed him into the back of the cruiser, the cold metal biting into his skin. He would survive. Because the world needed to know. Jackson felt his stomach twist as the reality of the situation weighed heavily on him. There was no escape, no way out. They weren't going to help him. They weren't going to do anything other than tighten the noose around him. It was then that he heard a faint, chilling sound, the voice of the superior officer crackling through the radio in his hand. Make sure there's no video left behind, the voice commanded. Jackson's blood ran cold. He felt a surge of panic flooding his veins. They weren't just trying to arrest him, they were trying to erase him, to wipe out any evidence of what was happening. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee, to get as far away from these officers as possible. But he knew better than to make any sudden moves. That would be the end for him, a death sentence. He was trapped. Every option felt like a trap. Stay silent, comply, and they could twist it against him. Resist, and they'd have the excuse they were waiting for. He felt his breath quickening, his hands trembling. The world around him seemed to narrow, his field of vision shrinking, until all he could see was the superior officer's cold eyes locked onto his. You think you can push back? The superior officer said, his tone a deadly calm. You're out of options, son. You can either comply, or we'll make this a lot harder for you. Jackson swallowed hard, his throat tight. He stared at the officer, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him like a hammer. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to fight, to resist. But he knew the terrifying truth: he was alone. The tension around them was suffocating. The neighborhood, once a place of safety and familiarity, now felt like a cage closing in around him. The neighbors who had gathered watched with wide eyes, murmuring among themselves, but none of them moved to intervene. It was as if he had become invisible, just another black man, caught up in a scene that was all too familiar. Then, something shifted. The superior officer's gaze lingered on him a second longer, his brow furrowing, as if trying to place him. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like the man was reconsidering, perhaps even doubting the situation. But just as quickly, his expression hardened again. But then, one of the newer officers, Cole Davis, who had arrived in the second cruiser, stepped forward, his face creased with uncertainty. He looked deeply at Jackson, eyes scanning his features as if piecing together a puzzle. Wait a second, Davis murmured. He glanced at the others, then back to Jackson, taking a step closer. I've seen you before, haven't I? Jackson's pulse quickened. This was his chance. He swallowed the fear that threatened to choke him and forced himself to speak, keeping his voice steady, controlled. I'm not a criminal. I'm a college student. I go to law school, actually. I live in this neighborhood. You've got the wrong guy. Davis hesitated, something in Jackson's tone making him pause. College student, he repeated, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. The superior officer's gaze darkened, but he didn't stop Davis. Officer Claude, however, stiffened, her hand twitching toward her holster as she spat out, "Don't buy into his excuses. We've been after someone who matches his description, a black guy, mid-20s, driving a high-end car, hacking into our system, and exposing officer data." Jackson blinked, disbelief mingling with the cold dread in his stomach. Hacking? They thought he was some kind of cyber criminal? He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He knew nothing about hacking. All he wanted was to get through law school, to become a judge like his father. But Claude's eyes bore into him, filled with something deeper than suspicion, hatred. Davis frowned, his gaze shifting between Jackson and the superior officer. This doesn't add up, he said quietly, shaking his head. I've seen this guy before at a community event. I think you're Jackson Albert, right? Jackson blinked in surprise. Yeah, that's me. I volunteer at local events. I'm studying to be a judge. Davis nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. Yeah, that's where I remember you from. My little brother's school had a career day last month. You were one of the speakers. Jackson nodded, a small flicker of hope sparking in his chest. But that hope was short-lived. Officer Claude stepped hard forward, her face a mask of fury. I don't care where he's been, she hissed. He fits the profile, and he's driving a car just like the one reported stolen last week. Davis glanced at the superior officer for guidance, but the older man's expression remained unreadable. His hand hovered over his radio, eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold. Davis took a deep breath, his voice steady but firm. This might not be the guy we're looking for. Claude's eyes blazed with rage. She didn't move, but Jackson could see the tension coiled in her frame, like a snake ready to strike. He knew then that this wasn't just about the car or some ridiculous accusation of hacking. It was about something far more personal, something rooted deep in her a lifetime of biases and hatred that had been drilled into her since childhood. Jackson took a deep breath, forcing himself to stand tall. His gaze locked onto Claude's, his voice low but clear. You haven't even bothered to run my plates properly, have you? You saw me, you saw this car, and you made an assumption because of the color of my skin. Claude's eyes widened, then narrowed, her fists clenching at her sides. But before she could respond, Davis stepped between them.
Let me check his plates, his license, figure out what's really happening here.
The superior officer, sensing the shift in the air, nodded silently. Claude, however, stood rigid, fury radiating off her. She said nothing as Davis moved quickly, tapping away at his handheld device, running Jackson's information through the system. Time seemed to crawl. Every second felt like an hour as Jackson stood there, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. He could see Claude's tense posture, the hatred simmering just below the surface, ready to explode. This wasn't about the car or even the supposed hacker. This was about something far uglier. Finally, Davis looked up, holding the results on his screen. His face was calm, but there was a tightness around his mouth. The car's clean, he said quietly. Registration checks out. No reports of it being stolen. Jackson exhaled slowly, the tightness in his chest easing. But it wasn't over. He could still feel Claude's gaze on him, burning with barely contained rage. I told you, Jackson said softly. You had the wrong guy. The superior officer sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to dispel the tension in the air. Looks like we made a mistake here, he said, his voice heavy with unspoken apology. Claude's face twisted, her lips pulling back in a snarl. This doesn't make sense, she snapped, glaring at Jackson as if the truth was somehow his fault. He fits the profile. He must be hiding something. But Davis shook his head, his voice firm and unyielding. Let it go, Claude. We were wrong. This isn't our guy. The silence that followed was thick, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Finally, the superior officer spoke, his voice low but commanding. Claude, that's enough. For a moment it seemed like she might not listen. But then, slowly she stepped back, her hand dropping from her holster. The hatred in her eyes, however, remained. The superior officer turned to Jackson, his voice softer now. You're free to go, sir. But Jackson shook his head, his voice strong. No, you targeted me because of my skin color. You didn't check the facts. You just assumed. Claude looked away, her jaw clenched tight. And then, to everyone's shock, she broke. Tears welled up in her eyes, her shoulders shaking as she whispered, I was just doing my job. Jackson's gaze didn't waver. No, you weren't. You were being racist. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences.